Welcome to this second class of the course. My name is Brian Russell Graham. You were reading chapters 1 and 2 of the book for this class. I hope you enjoyed making your way through the author's discussion of the first two phases of postmodernism. Let's dive straight into it. I had asked you to work with the questions you can see here, which relate to chapter 2, although we're going to need to backtrack to chapter 1 as well. To begin with, what a reader might find interesting in terms of explanations in this second chapter, many readers will no doubt be appreciative of the main thesis of this part of the book, which is that in the 80s and 90s, the second wave of applied postmodernists focused on dismantling hierarchies and making truth claims about power, language, and oppression, and that the two postmodern principles and the four postmodern themes get retained in what the authors call applied postmodernism. Now, the iteration of the outlines of this thesis get presented in the opening untitled section of the chapter, and also in the sections bearing the titles Mutation of Theory, A New Default, and the Postmodern Principles and Themes in Application. Also of interest to me in the first untitled section is the account of how a new generation of theorists emerged in the late 80s and early 90s, applied modernists, and, quote, how theory mutated into a handful of theories, post-colonial, queer, and critical race, that were put to work in the world to deconstruct social injustice. As someone with a background in literary studies, I am more used to hearing about how deconstruction as a critical procedure was supplanted by new historicism or cultural materialism in Britain. It was certainly interesting to read a more general account of what followed in the wake of the high deconstructive phase. In the section applying the inapplicable, we zoom in, and the more detailed discussion helps us understand the nature of the shift to applied postmodernism. It's interesting to read about how, even if some post-colonial theorists relied on Jacques Derrida, his work, their criticism, the criticism of these post-colonial theorists, exhibits an explicitly political purpose, the authors tell us. Also fascinating is the account of how different postmodern thinkers, feminist scholars in this case, find different ways of working through the legacy of the original postmodernism and developing an applied postmodernism. Povey, Butler, and bell hooks arrive at vastly different conclusions about the postmodern legacy, but they all find ways of making postmodernism actionable, to use the author's term, and that all makes for fascinating reading. Also interesting is how intersectionality emerged out of this desire to retain many of the insights of postmodernism while moving decisively onto a new paradigm. And I quote, Kimberly Crenshaw wanted to both keep the theoretical understanding of race and gender as social constructs and use deconstructive methods to critique them and assert a stable truth claim. I was also intrigued by the author's sense that there is a parallel between the situation Descartes faced in the 17th century and the challenge faced by theorists in the 1980s. The thinking self is, of course, the bedrock of Descartes' epistemology, and Pluckrose and Lindsay argue that the theorists of the 80s, again working through the legacy of earlier postmodernism, decided that, and I quote, the suffering associated with oppression implied the existence of something that could suffer and a mechanism by which that suffering can occur, which provided them with a bedrock for their epistemology, the authors suggest. Switching to what a reader might find interesting in terms of critique, The sections in the postmodern principles and the postmodern principles and themes in application about the blurring of boundaries and the power of language include some criticism of those two postmodern themes in the applied phase. With regards to the former, the blurring of boundaries, because of how it tries to combine a large number of ways of knowing, applied postmodernism, especially critical race theory, the authors tell us, is characterized by, and I quote, a messy mixing of the evidenced and the experiential, in which personal interpretation of lived experience, often informed or misinformed theory, is elevated to the status of evidence, usually of theory. And when speaking of the power of language, the authors express critical skepticism about the notion that words are powerful and dangerous, and unhappiness about what that questionable idea leads to. So some elements of critique. If we feel that there is not enough critique in chapter 2, I think that's partly because the authors chose to advance some important critical points in the first chapter. And we might profitably turn to one or two features of what they say in that earlier chapter. With respect to the postmodern knowledge principle, in chapter 1, the authors argue that there is no need for a new knowledge principle. The forms of cognition fostered by classical liberalism, misrepresented in postmodern writings, they suggest, are, and I quote, not so much meta-narratives as imperfect but self-correcting processes that apply a productive and actionable form of skepticism to everything, including themselves. In other words, epistemologically, classical liberalism is sophisticated and sound. The authors also express great skepticism towards the postmodern knowledge principle when they speak unfavorably of adherents' unwillingness to mount defenses of postmodernism. And I quote, because of its rejection of objective truth and reason, postmodernism refuses to substantiate itself and cannot therefore be argued with. In connection with the postmodern political principle, in chapter 1, we hear of how an undervaluation of liberalism seems baked into postmodernism, which raises questions about the need for postmodern politics. After going through a list of liberalism's political achievements, which I'll show you, the authors wryly observe this all occurred before postmodernism became influential. And you can see what they list as liberalism's achievement on that slide. Feel free to pause the video if you want to examine the details of that. I'll return to that dimension of critique in a moment or two, but let's proceed to question 2 first. How interesting are the references to liberalism in this chapter? I think we can deal with this question fairly quickly. I pose this question because, along with its nemesis, theory, liberalism is our main interest when reading this book. Most of the reflections on liberalism are packed into the final chapter, which we'll talk about in the last class, but all references to liberalism are, of course, of interest to us. So the authors don't say a great deal about liberalism in chapter 2, but what they do say is quite suggestive. On a couple of occasions, they argue that while the civil rights movement falls within the boundaries of classical liberalism, identity politics and Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality fall outside that domain. Commenting on a section of Crenshaw's influential essay, Mapping the Margins, the two authors observe, she distinguishes between a black person and a person who happens to be black and sides with the former, arguing that this distinction is integral to identity politics and marks its difference from the universal liberal approaches that characterize the civil rights movements. Like the UK philosopher John Gray, Pluckrose and Lindsay believe that universalism is a key ingredient in classical liberalism, and the particularism of intersectionality means that it is non-liberal. Crenshaw doesn't explicitly reference liberalism in the passage in question. The inference that this universalist approach is allied to both liberalism and civil rights seems fair enough. As I say, we find out more about liberalism in the final chapter of the book, but what they say here in chapter 2 is quite suggestive. I'll return to this issue of the nature of identity politics, its falling outside of the general area of classical liberalism, and the contradistinction between identity politics and the civil rights movement when we turn to the fourth question we're working with today. Third question, what might we have liked to have heard more about? That takes me back to the issue of critique rather than explanation. I think it's fair to say that the authors have held back from critiquing two of the four postmodern themes. So far, the critique is fairly effective, but there's room for more generally, and vis-a-vis the two of these four themes, specifically cultural relativism and the loss of the individual and the loss of the individual and the universal. Got descriptions of cultural relativism, but no critique. We can infer that they take a low view of it, but clearly there's a gap in the argumentation there. And much the same is true of the theme of the loss of the individual and the universal. No real critique as of yet. Descriptions, yes, but no critique, even if we can infer what their attitude is. So a couple of things we might have liked to have heard more about. Of course, we're going to hear more about these postmodern themes in the final chapter, so we don't have to wait so long. More of a critique of intersectionality might have been interesting as well. But yes, we get that critique in chapter 5 of the book. The subject, of course, gets raised in chapter 2, and perhaps in connection with that, I might quickly sum up the critique presented in chapter 5, perhaps piquing your interest in that later chapter. Clear in chapter 5 and in the very final section of this book, where the authors offer a statement of principles, that while they view favorably the basic insight of intersectionality, that in some cases unique injustices lie in intersected identities, they view intersectionality, how it has evolved, in rather negative terms. I think we could safely say that the authors present a barrage of criticisms of intersectionality in the 5th chapter. And if I take a deep breath, I can perhaps quickly give you an account of that range of criticisms that they present. So to begin with, intersectionality is, from the point of view of the authors, incredibly internally complex because of the myriad number of categories and subcategories of identity. It is, quote, also messy because it is so highly interpretive. It operates on so many levels of identity simultaneously, each of which has different claims to a relative degree of marginalization, not all of which are directly comparable. It reduces everything to prejudice as understood under the power dynamics asserted by theory. It is riddled with divisions and subcategories which exist in competition with each other. It's as though intersectionalists want to develop a caste system, the authors argue. The notion of the individual is demoted in intersectionality. Intersectionality is often evoked to cancel people. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, it is characterized by divisiveness, pessimism, and cynicism, the authors suggest. Last of all, any points of disagreement? any criticisms of the lines of argumentation in this chapter. I would suggest that by the time we read chapter 2, we might, by the time we come to the end of the chapter, we might start to feel that something important has been jumped over in this book. The problem, to my mind, is that we have no account of the emergence of identity politics, no story of how outside university walls, identity politics emerged in the 1960s. And because of that, the book offers no proper understanding of what identity politics is, I would argue. As I mentioned earlier, when discussing intersectionality, the book presents us with hints about how there is an important difference between civil rights movement and identity politics, but we don't hear enough about this. Well, I should have gone into a chapter on this theme. In brief, such a chapter would deal with how Black Power, rather than the civil rights movement, provided a template for identity politics, meaning that all strands of future identity politics came to be characterized by the more militant and unappealing kind of politics of recognition. I think that an account should also do justice to the incoherence at the center of such politics as well. So, a proper account might begin with the separatism that characterized early identity politics in the form of Black Power. I'm going to be referencing a small number of books as I give an account of, I think, such a chapter might have included. You can see 4 books I'm going to refer to on this slide. So, citing Todd Gitlin, an account of early identity politics might explain how Black Power activists adopted a separatist attitude to the US. The country is rotten to the core, they would have argued, preferring to think in terms of bitter, separate destinies, separatism. Going on Todd Gitlin again, one could provide an account of how the SNCC or SNCC and the Black Panthers championed not a redemptive struggle across racial lines in the manner of King, but rather separatist political insurgency. Such an account might well have pointed out that from the start, identity politics, with its preference for separate and pronounced identity, marked the end of a particular kind of national and collective way of thinking about the future. It marked, in Gitlin's resonant phrase, the twilight of common dreams. Such an account could reference the cachet acquired by the idea of lived experience from the 1970s onwards, which obviously works against the idea of common dreams while emphasizing the differences between not just dominant and subordinate groups, but between all groups in society. There, such a chapter might turn to activists preferring to ally themselves with international causes beyond America's shores. For Black Power, it was Third World Revolution. Gitlin directs our attention to the writings of Julius Lester and interprets the slogan Black Power, Stokely Carmichael's phrase, as, and I quote, partly advocating a black role in a hypothetically unified Third World Revolution. At the same time, identity politics can also make what appear to be remarkably hyperbolic statements about the nature of the challenges faced by powerless groups in society. Such a disquisition, such a chapter, might have continued by turning to Christopher Lasch for insights into how, whether it is directed against domestic or foreign powers oppressing their allies, the activism characterizing identity politics from this time on was characterized by hyperbolic statements about groups facing genocide. Lasch draws readers' attention to Black Power claims that white America was aiming to destroy Black America through birth control and intermarriage. Such a chapter could comment on the fact that when Christopher Lasch felt the need to revisit the notion of narcissism in his book, The Minimal Self, he decided that it was mainly a matter of reading struggles against oppression through the lens of genocide and therefore survival. Such an account might have done justice to the fact that despite such grand struggles, from an early stage, identity politics partly saw the solution to oppression in psychological terms. Identity politics emerged in the wake of the so-called therapeutic turn, and it was shaped and conditioned by that earlier turn. Here, one might turn to Elizabeth Lash Quinn, Lash's daughter, in fact, and her volume Race Experts. With the help of Lash Quinn, such a chapter could explain how, despite the staggering dissonance between myths and claims about genocide, for example, from the Black Power period on, racial injustices were recast as primarily an issue of therapy rather than justice or equality. The therapeutic sensibility determined that people viewed race in terms of individual growth, emotional well-being, and gratification. A proper account would, citing Lash again, Christopher Lash, go on to discuss how identity politics sets up a victim culture, how it did so from the beginning, and also insists that the victim is morally superior, thereby bringing about a seismic shift in our moral culture. At that point, one might reference Campbell and Manning's thesis about how our moral culture, having proceeded from honor to dignity, is slowly proceeding to victimhood culture. An assessment of political correctness, important to discuss in connection with identity politics, would follow on logically from this. Identity politics went hand in hand from the start with what Greg Lukianoff has called the first great age of political correctness. A discussion of this development worth its salt would need to focus on the emphasis on controlling language and imagery which characterized it. Mocking political correctness, Todd Gitlin, who also emphasized how the political right exaggerates the follies of political correctness, nonetheless refers to its main characteristic in the period as, and I quote, a self-satirizing obsession with rectifying the language of opponents. Much of such a discussion would serve as testimony to the fact that this kind of politics amounts to a rejection of liberalism, owing to its rejection of the universalism which is key to liberalism. In particular, the vaunting of lived experience and the emphasis on separate destinies for groups are clear signs that this brand of politics amounts to a rejection of the universalism characterizing classical liberalism. It could, of course, be argued that liberal movements like the civil rights movement are characterized by national rather than universal concerns. As Gitlin explains, at the heart of universalism is, and I quote, a conviction that there is a common human condition on the basis of which progress is at least possible. And it is this understanding of universalism that is integral to classical liberalism. Pluckrose and Lindsay write persuasively about how identity politics goes hand in hand with the sense that we're all victims. They discuss the idea of lived experience at length, and the discussion does, of course, address the nature of political correctness. I don't think it's enough. I can't help but feel that a separate discussion of such politics at an early stage of this book would not only have filled a gap, but also set things up nicely for how identity politics gets processed in universities from the 70s on. My account of an unwritten but perhaps necessary chapter there probably speaks to a problem with the argument arc in this book. The story that is told is one in which a number of ideas incubate in universities and only impact on the world outside of universities from 2010 onwards. But we need a narrative which does justice to how lots of developments outside the university are key to this story. So ideally, the story would back and forth between the world and the university. In my next lecture, I'll consider a second example of this, where something that happens outside of university walls is absolutely crucial to the story being told. So last of all, I just have to share with you the questions that you are working with for next time. As you can see there, you're reading social justice scholarship and thought for next time. And these are the questions that I would like us to be thinking about. Number one, it may be that the opening section and last two sections of the chapter are the sections which are the most critical of social justice scholarship. Which aspects of the critique do you find most striking? Two, it may be that the rest of this chapter throws the emphasis onto explaining rather than critiquing. Which explanations are you especially appreciative of? Number three, what else would you have liked to have heard more about? And four, do you have any criticisms of the lines of argumentation in this chapter? It's a fascinating chapter in the book, and I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts with you about it next time. Thanks for today.